The first public fire brigades were formed in the early 19th century to cope with the threat of fire in the industrial heartlands. Hours were long, often with systems of continuous duty. Conditions were tough.
Your workplace was where you lived. Your family were subject to the conditions in the workplace and so on. And that whole system was actually described at one time as being municipal slaves.
There were no pensions, and pay was deducted for sickness. Fire brigades largely looked to the Navy for recruits. The strict code of military-style discipline had a huge impact on family life.
Even in the times when they weren't actually available for call, they were still controlled by the job. And there are instructions about whether you could or could not sleep with your wife on particular nights before you went on duty.
A spit and polish culture was heavily enforced.
Firefighters had to clean the station as a whole, which could involve mucking out the stables, up to doing something like cleaning the chief fire officer's toilet.
The aftermath of World War I was a time of massive social and political upheaval. Workers in many different industries organised themselves and campaigned for change. In 1918, the police went on strike for better pay, and this radical action paved the way for a group of 200 firefighters in London to form a union, first known as the Firemen's Trade Union.
I think the creation of the union in 1918 was quite a remarkable breakthrough, and I think it allowed people to focus on fire service specific issues like the continuous duty system, like the sort of militaristic discipline that existed at the time.
It was a revolutionary act, and they chose their new leader wisely. Jim Bradley was the son of a station officer. He worked as a park keeper, but could lobby more effectively for change from outside the profession. He was well connected in local labour and trade union circles. In 1920, a parliamentary committee was established to investigate the fire service.
One of the first things the union did is it gave evidence to the select committee, and they advocated the creation of professional standards and conditions of service.
This committee approved Jim Bradley's demand for pay parity with the police. He had also won London members 1 day off a week and 14 days holiday a year. Membership grew across the country, and in 1930, the union was renamed the Fire Brigades Union. The 30s saw more great social and political upheaval. Spain was in the grip of civil war, and Nazi Germany was flexing its military might.
The bombing of Guernica showed to British fire service policymakers that any forthcoming war would involve mass bombing raids on British towns and cities, using predominantly fire as the main source of weapon, through incendiary bombs.
It was becoming clear there'd be a need for a much larger and national fire service to cope with a new kind of war, from the air.
The Fire Brigades Union played a key role in that debate, alerting people to the threats, raising the issue about the need for planning in advance of this, raising the need for standardisation of equipment because we had a fragmented fire service pre-war. And the union very clearly said this fire service as it is will not be able to cope with that level of threat.
In 1938, the Fire Brigades Act was passed, requiring all local authorities to maintain efficient firefighting services. The Act created 360 new fire stations and an auxiliary fire service with full and part-time recruits. When war broke out in 1939, there were 200,000 auxiliaries across the country.
They hired volunteers from all walks of life, ranging from black cab taxi drivers up to bank office managers and bank clerks. The ex-Navy chaps were initially resistant to the idea of outsiders coming into the service and diluting its culture.
But the FBU's new General Secretary, 27-year-old John Horner, persuaded union members to create a new section of the union solely for AFS members. As a result, by 1940, the union's ranks swelled enormously from 3,500 to 67,000.
It put the union on the map, both in terms of the national trade union movement, but also as one of the driving forces behind reform within the fire service.
On September the 7th, 1940, the Blitz attacks began and endured nationwide until May 1941. Firefighters had one of the most dangerous jobs of all the civilian protection services. But auxiliaries were paid less than the regulars, got less time off, less sick pay, and had to cope with just one uniform. Historian Stephanie Maltman has set up a charity installing plaques to commemorate the sacrifice of AFS firefighters.
And I saw the film by Humphrey Jennings, Fires Were Started, which was made actually to celebrate the auxiliary fire service. These fires that nobody, not even regular firemen, had seen before, on a scale that nobody had seen before. Everybody was shocked.
AFS recruits received only basic training, but faced enormous dangers.
Harry Errington, Erringott was his name, who was a Jewish tailor and cutter. He and some other firemen were sheltering in the basement of the substation in Soho, and a bomb fell.
It killed 20 people, including 6 firefighters. Errington saved 2 lives at great risk to his own and badly burnt his hands. He was one of just 3 firefighters to receive the George Cross Medal during the war. But on the day he received his citation from Buckingham Palace, he lost his job because injured men were only kept on full pay for 13 weeks.
That was an issue that John Horner, the General Secretary of the Union, took up, setting out demands to try and improve the conditions for the AFS firefighters.
In the beginning, their welfare was very much overlooked, I think.
The Jennings drama showed how during World War II, the fire service recruited women for the very first time.
Trinidad Street, cabin number 1. Heavy Unit 1 to Trinidad Street.
Women were taken on not to fight fires, not as firefighters as such, but they were taken on for other roles like watchroom duties, drivers, dispatch riders. They even helped with repair of hoses and tailoring. They were cooks, field kitchens and so on. So even though they weren't taken on as firefighters, when it came to it, I think a lot of them actually stepped up to and did fight fires.
At its peak, over 88,000 women worked full or part-time as fire auxiliaries. 8,000 joined the FBU. On the night of December 29th, 1940, the Luftwaffe directly targeted a square mile around St. Paul's. Over 100,000 incendiary bombs dropped that night. Churchill had decreed St. Paul's must be saved to preserve morale.
The issue of how firefighters could get sufficient water to tackle the fires on this scale was a huge factor. They used the Thames, but the Thames is a tidal river. They brought pumps out onto the mud, and that meant, of course, when the tide rose again, that equipment was lost.
Over 1,400 fires raged in the city, requiring almost 3,000 pumps from London and beyond. St Paul's was saved, but 16 firefighters lost their lives.
What we have here is the National Firefighters Memorial, which was established to commemorate, firstly, firefighters killed during the Blitz, but now records all firefighters who've been killed in the line of duty. One story stands out for me. Herbert Blundell, who was killed, hadn't completed a week's work, and therefore his widow, not receiving the final week's pay, couldn't afford to bury him. And his comrade here, Benjamin Chinnery, who was also killed, his widow agreed, therefore, that they should be buried together.
By 1941, the fire service's crucial role in the war was recognised by the Home Office. The entire fire service was nationalised, ensuring resources, equipment and people could rapidly be deployed.
The nationalisation of the fire service equalised paying conditions. There was no longer that distinction between the AFS officer and the regular firefighter. They were all national firefighters.
With 75,000 members, the FBU was now recognised as the negotiator for firefighters and could now hold meetings in fire stations. By the end of the war, a total of 900 firefighters, both men and women, had lost their lives. But the union was stronger than it had ever been. It had won firefighters an 84-hour week, a weekly wage of £4.06, and injury pay had been doubled. The end of the war was a cause for mass celebrations. The ensuing landslide election of Clement Attlee became a mandate for social reform.
There was an election of the Labour government in 1945 that marked a big change of direction on lots of public issues like public services, public ownership and so on. And that also influenced the fire service.
John Horner now pushed for a 48-hour working week.
John was a very tall man, very, very strong man. I mean, I would not have wanted to have been an employer on the other side of the table, or for that matter, the Home Secretary, if they were meeting John Horner, because John Horner would win that discussion.
Under his influence, the 1947 Fire Services Act created 135 locally controlled fire authorities with a national structure for rates of pay, pensions, a fixed working week, inspections, and improved equipment and uniform. Importantly, there would now be a direct channel of communication between the union and government on matters of fire safety.
It's the Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council, which has the ear of the Home Secretary and advises him on fire service related policy. So that again gives the union a footing into national corridors of power.
Firefighting was becoming a skilled and respectable working class career. But wages still had to be defended.
Employers set to clip their wings and reduce firefighter pay to levels that were similar to those in the 1930s.
Things came to a head in late 1951. For the first time ever, FBU members worked to rule.
Roughly half of the firefighters across the UK boycotted non-essential duties. So things like station and appliance cleaning, or cleaning their uniforms, you know, scrubbing the chief officer's toilet.
They marched in what were known as the spit and polish demonstrations, calling for continued pay parity with the police.
It was sadly unsuccessful because parity with the police was broken shortly thereafter, and from that point onwards there was this drift in wages and conditions between the two services.
The union continued to press for improvements to the fire service. But it took until 1961 to win members a 48-hour week. John Horner's landmark FBU document, A Service for the 60s, inspired Kevin Brown, who entered the service in the 70s and experienced its long-lasting impact.
It was the first document which actually set out the way that the fire service and at firefighter level, at fire station level, would change, whereby the fire service then would be responsible for all aspects of the fire safety legislation, fire prevention, fire precautions, and believe it or not, that was radical for the vision of the fire service.
As the population swelled, fire prevention was becoming a major concern. Glasgow, with its busy, overcrowded warehouse district, was particularly at risk. Roddy McAllister is all too familiar with its incendiary history.
The city of Glasgow was known as the Tinderbox City because of the amount of fires and the magnitude of the fires they attended. Glasgow Fire Service was one of the busiest in the world.
In 1960, a whisky and tobacco warehouse on Cheapside was engulfed in flames.
At the time, I was a 5-year-old child. My eldest sister was married to a firefighter. On the night of the 28th of March, they responded to a fire call. There were rivers of whisky on fire running down the street. There was an incident involving a turntable ladder where the fireman at the head of the ladder was blown off and was kept on the ladder by his ankle. Around 1950 hours, there was a massive explosion and it engulfed the fire crews that were fighting the fire. Unfortunately, my 27-year-old brother-in-law was one of them, leaving my sister a widow at just under 25 years of age with 4 children.
19 firefighters died that night. It was the biggest loss of firefighter life since the war. The fires in Glasgow didn't stop. In 1968, on James Watt Street, a fire at a furniture factory with barred windows and locked exits killed 22 staff trapped inside. The union, now led by General Secretary Terry Parry, submitted a report to government advocating more stringent fire safety regulations in public buildings, hotels and workplaces.
Fires like Cheapside, James Watt Street, multiple others, these were really, really important for triggering what we call tombstone legislation. It culminated in 1971 with the Fire Precautions Act. It empowered fire brigades to take a more proactive role in fire safety and in preventing large-scale fire disasters.
In Northern Ireland, firefighters confronted a totally different magnitude of danger in fighting fires. Starting in the early 70s, the Troubles, involving bombings, shootings, and the British Army on the streets, created unique challenges for firefighters.
The conflict, the Troubles, the war, the Civil War, it permeated every aspect of our lives, our personal lives, our working lives, our social lives.
Incendiary devices gone off, were gone off all around the city. There was nowhere had the same intensity or the number of what we call major fires. There was nowhere. A firefighter in Belfast in 2 years would fight major fires probably more often in them days than someone in, say, Manchester would fight in 20.
Sometimes you would begin into a building and you would walk past a bomb, you wouldn't even see it. Sometimes maybe if the place had partially collapsed, it would bury a bomb that hadn't gone off. Sometimes you would be standing in a smoke-filled room and the smoke cleared and you looked down and there was another bomb at your feet. You know, so this sort of thing just went on day and daily.
On more than one occasion, I personally was involved in incidents where we came under gunfire.
Northern Ireland's fire service recruited from both Protestant and Catholic communities. To maintain unity, the FBU pursued a policy of firm neutrality.
There was a sort of an unwritten rule that we left politics and everything else at the front gate, and whenever you went into the fire station and put on the uniform, that was it. There was no conflict.
The FBU, in conjunction with our employers, with the brigade, were very conscious of the risk that we were at out there. There were communications going on with some very dangerous people, paramilitaries, to emphasise to them that the fire service were not to be identified with the security forces, that we were a neutral organisation, that we represented and served the entire community.
By the end of 1976, there had been over 5,000 bomb attacks in Northern Ireland. Yet firefighters here were paid less than their mainland colleagues, and unlike police and prison officers, received no danger money. Things came to a head that year.
We asked for danger money because of the different type of work we were doing. We said, look, can you pay us a bit extra because we think we deserve it? We'll have to leave our wives in the morning and we're walking towards a situation that other people are running away from. And that's okay in a domestic situation, but we shouldn't be doing this in a situation of civil strife.
Members across the province worked to rule, refusing to attend any incident caused by terrorism. They won an extra £4 a week. On the back of this token increase, FBU members in Northern Ireland remained solidly in support of national action that was brewing over pay. By the mid-70s, the British economy was on its knees. Steep inflation, an IMF bailout, and job losses led to strikes as workers tried to protect pay and conditions. The James Callaghan government's policy of wage restraint had forced down real wages, and firefighters were struggling to make ends meet. Take-home pay of £48 a week was well under average male earnings.
I lived in a heavily industrialised area in the northeast, used to the shipyards and the mines and people who were earning whatever they were earning at that time, and firefighters at that time were considerably lower paid than all of the people in industry at that time.
I myself relied on the magnificence, the benevolence of bus drivers for free bus travel, and many of us did, because the pay was really, really poor. We'd fallen a long way behind.
The anger that was producing led eventually to this explosion in 1977, a real determined effort of firefighters on fire stations all across the country walking out in an all-out strike.
30,000 firefighters demanded a 30% pay rise and a 40-hour working week.
The vote and the support for strike, certainly within Greater Manchester, was virtually unanimous. The picket lines were full.
My colleagues on the picket line were men of all age, early 20s, with young families, and there was a strike fund which we campaigned in the street for. Basically, we had to beg for money to survive.
The government ordered the armed forces to provide cover using World War II-era green goddesses.
Depending on the nature of the incident, firefighters would respond to assist and advise the military, because we certainly were not in the business, if you will, of seeing people lose their lives and lose their livelihoods.
Eventually, something had to give on both sides.
One of the driving factors that I think forced the government to come to a settlement was the amount of losses that the insurance companies were experiencing. They were getting pressure from private industry and all the rest of it to get this solved.
After 9 bitter weeks, the executive recommended members accept the 10% pay offer.
The thing that really sold it for many people was the likelihood, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed, but the likelihood of some kind of pay formula.
We also changed our shift system, then went onto the watch system, so you were consistently on with the same group. I was attached to Green Watch, 4 days on, 4 days off, which was a much improved system at that time.
Looking back, it established a new pay formula that lasted a generation, 25 years. It set the standard for pay in the fire service. It was, in a way, a coming of age of the union and improved conditions for a whole generation.
In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher was voted into office in a landslide victory. She pledged to take on the power of the trade unions. Five days later, a huge blaze broke out at Woolworths in the centre of Manchester. Kevin Brown was one of the first firefighters on the scene.
Can you tell us something about your recollection of that day?
You could see from a mile away from Phillips Park station, thick black smoke in the sky over the city. Crews from my station saw that there were a significant number of people trapped on one of the upper floors. We were tasked with attempting to make rescues from the inside, whilst crews attempted to make rescues outside. Very, very hot conditions, very smoky. We really struggled to make a lot of progress. We had no gloves, we had no ear protection, so to actually make an entry into the building was very difficult.
10 people died, many from inhaling smoke containing cyanide produced by flammable polyurethane foam in the furniture department.
It was the straw that broke the camel's back. The significant loss of life led for a campaign to have a look at what was filling our furniture.
National Officer Mike Fordham was appointed to lead on health and safety. With TUC and Labour Party backing, he fought a campaign to improve safety rules.
We called for sprinklers, banning of foam furniture, and better means of escape from shops and stores.
The government response was to produce public information films.
Watch this test and see just how fast fire in an upholstered armchair spreads. Remember, smoke kills.
Yet Thatcher sided with foam manufacturers and for 9 years resisted union calls to ban flammable foam.
Normally it needs large numbers of people, sadly, to die before government react to things. Government ministers always explain it to me that until society reacts, we're not going to react.
Things came to a head over the Christmas holiday of 1987, when 17 children died from burning foam in house fires.
We decided to unashamedly use the deaths of those children to create something that would force government to change its mind. And finally, we managed to get the regulations on foam furniture, which have literally saved thousands of lives since that day. And it's one of the things I'm certainly proudest of in my time with the FBU.
Meanwhile, in 1984, the country's most powerful trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers, went on strike against pit closures.
This is the fight for the right to work!
Thatcher was determined to break them and froze the union's bank accounts. The FBU supported the miners, knowing that a defeat for them would be a defeat for all trade unions. General Secretary Ken Cameron dipped deep into FBU funds for a loan.
It was delivered, literally, £100,000 in a cardboard box to Arthur Scargill's flat in the Barbican to allow the NUM to continue to operate and to continue to fight the campaign that they were doing.
In addition, every region of the FBU adopted collieries and sent money. But Thatcher triumphed, pushing through legislation that curtailed union powers. The miners' defeat was a savage blow for the entire trade union movement. Three years later, a tragic event in London would trigger a new campaign agenda for the FBU.
One of the defining moments of the 1980s was the horrific fire here at King's Cross Underground Station on the 18th of November 1987. It was a huge incident involving 30 fire crews. 6 firefighters received awards as a result of their actions that night.
When we got to King's Cross, there was smoke coming out of every orifice of the station, the mayhem and the catastrophe, and it was just huge. It was unbelievable. And this is my really sad memory. It makes me quite sad to think. As we were going in, they brought the body out, or somebody who we didn't know, and then immediately I thought, oh, he's got a fire tunic on.
Station officer Colin Townsley was one of 31 people to die in the King's Cross fire.
Colin Townsley's funeral was a huge event. It struck that chord with people, and that in turn had an impact on the debate that was taking place about safety in the underground and the safety of firefighters, and that discussion about the protective equipment that firefighters have.
At the public inquiry, the FBU denounced firefighters' inadequate clothing, plastic leggings that melted under the intense heat, rubber gloves that restricted movement, woolen tunics. The union won its demand for modern protective uniforms. King's Cross was one of the first major fires Sian Griffiths attended. She joined up in the early 80s when the fire service was trying to modernise and actively recruit women to fight fires. Since World War II, women had been confined to control room jobs.
Ken Livingstone was head of the GLC. He was trying to make a difference and balance up the imbalances in society. I was pretty much a single parent, and I thought I needed a man's job just because I would get more money. So it was as basic as that. You did get the feeling that, as women, that they were ready for you to fail at any moment. They were just waiting. They didn't expect you to get through a week, 2 weeks. We had 16 weeks. And my determination was they're not going to fucking beat me at this one. I was never not able to put up a ladder or pick up a piece of equipment or carry somebody down a ladder. I was completely and utterly determined to succeed, no matter what.
women were expected to wear a male uniform and share toilet and shower facilities. They encountered hostility from some of their male colleagues.
There was abuse of women firefighters took place that was beyond any definition of anything that could be deemed to be acceptable. We internally within the FBU and within the Executive Council had difficulty in dealing with that.
Sian joined the union and became one of the first members of the Women's Committee to call for equal treatment.
What was really important was that we as women were together and we were able to talk about what was important to us and our experiences, and we grew from there. There were constant issues of discrimination and sexism. What we were able to do was say, we don't like this, let's do something about it. So things like the use of the term firefighter, that didn't happen like by magic. That happened by people like me and other people that come along and say, look, this document says he all the time. It's he and she, or they. So all those things were challenged.
Denise Christie, the daughter of a miner, joined the service in Scotland in the 90s when the culture had improved.
The fire station and, all the guys that I worked with, because it was predominantly men that I worked with at that time, they were really supportive. In fact, one of the firefighters encouraged me to become the women's rep and become more active in the women's section. They gave me my politics, they gave me my left feminist international politics. I learnt so much from the women's section that I then became the Scottish women's rep, and I was the last executive council member for women until the union decided that it didn't need quality sections at executive council level.
General Secretary Ken Cameron ensured that other minority groups were officially embraced by the FBU. Mickey Nicholas was one of a new generation of black firefighters to join the London Fire Brigade in 1990.
There was some really below-the-belt pranks, sometimes I guess they were called at that time, initiation ceremonies, welcome to the watch, welcome to the station stuff. The difference was that there wasn't ever a stop to it. Many black people found that long after the jokes had stopped for other people, the jokes continued for them. It was just purely a case of racism.
The FBU became aware that their black and ethnic minority members were starting to self-organise in response to discrimination against them.
Relationship between black people and women. There were several national officers at the time that were really supportive. I think they were also horrified that they didn't know about some of these things.
The FBU's Black and Ethnic Minority Section was created in 1995 to try and address their issues.
There was no tradition of BME people in the British Fire Service. We knew people who had stayed for 5, 6, maybe 10 years and hadn't stayed longer than that because they weren't prepared to put up with it anymore. They didn't feel that their issues were being dealt with, remedied, and so they didn't stay. So the big thing was retention.
Mickey recently received an MBE for his efforts to make the fire service more inclusive for BAME recruits, especially in London.
I think the vast majority of fire services now truly get the value of having a diverse workforce in terms of the community that it serves.
Yet today, across Britain, 97% of firefighters are white and only 6.5% of frontline firefighters are women. The FBU's equality officers are urging employers to enforce the 2010 Equality Act and recruit from all sections of society.
We've got so much to do and still, I dare say, on the ground, not enough people to do it sometimes. But if we're going to make a real good stab at progressing the inclusion agenda and moving things on, that's one of the things we really have to do as a trade union.
In May 1997, Tony Blair's Labour government swept into office.
We were generally thrilled that after 18 years of oppressive Toryism had now been consigned to the dustbin, we thought it's a new horizon.
We'd seen public services privatised, publicly owned utilities sold off, we'd seen an attack on the welfare state, and we'd seen legal changes that really constricted the rights of trade unions to operate. And that was the situation that we faced as we went into the Blair government after 1997.
I worried about the Blair government's relationship with workers. The anti-trade union laws which the Tories had brought in previously, I felt were very, very easy at that stage to repeal. And the Blair government didn't do that.
By 2001, the British economy was booming. The basic firefighter's wage was £21,000 a year, and there were increasing questions about the pay formula won after the 1977 strike.
Thatcherism had happened, consumerism had taken place, they had mortgages, they had tellies, they had cars. They saw huge salaries being paid to friends. The anger was born out of the necessity, in my opinion, to keep up with the pace of the country.
In July 2002, FBU members from across Britain lobbied the local authority employers meeting in Bournemouth for a pay rise.
Incredible atmosphere, incredible sense of purpose. We were down there to show our employers, our politicians, that we were serious. And it was justification in our pay claim.
Don't queue up at the nation's disasters to pat us on the back. Get out here now and tell us we're worth £30,000 a year.
Now, some people thought that the new Labour government then would have treated us fairly. How wrong were they? But some of us had an abiding mistrust of politicians. I knew from early on that this is going to go to the wire.
In August, the union rejected a 4% pay offer. Negotiations continued until November, when members voted for strike action and began a series of walkouts.
And it was a shocker. It was really shocking. It's not straightforward because whilst people are FBU, there's arguments. Should we and shouldn't we do this? And I'm going to lose money and I can't afford it. And, you know, I've got a mortgage to pay. And how do you convince people that this is the right thing to do, even though we've voted that way?
Outside the stations, firefighters faced a trial by the media. Andy Gilchrist's phone was hacked in an effort to discredit his leadership.
I mean, that's the thing that the government seems to be moving towards now. What do you think about that?
The national media, let's say the national right-wing media, the Murdoch press, were very hostile to us and did blatantly misrepresent things.
After 6 acrimonious months, members accepted a 16% pay rise over 3 years and a new pay structure. Retained duty staff were given equal pay, one step in a campaign for equality which eventually won them pension rights. But in return, the Blair government exacted a price, making changes to almost all aspects of the way the service operated.
In 2002, I believe that following that strike, we were put on a hit list by the government, and therefore we were attacked like we'd never been attacked.
In 2004, Parliament passed the Fire and Rescue Services Act, repealing the 1947 Fire Services Act. It expanded the responsibilities of the fire service and also crucially dismantled an important channel of communication between the FBU and government. The Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council, through which the fire service discussed and agreed standards with central government, was abolished.
With the abolition of those structures, those issues could only be raised effectively at local level. National safeguards and the national structures that had been put in place after the Second World War effectively were scrapped and got rid of.
In 2006, New Labour made further attacks, raising the pension age for new recruits from 55 to 60. The FBU warned that deregulation and the privatisation of building safety standards would hit fire safety. Morale and relations with government hit an all-time low.
New Labour were an absolute disgrace to the fire service. You know, from a political party that was made up and, you know, represented by trade unions, who were financially supported by trade unions, who were politically supported by trade unions and workers right throughout the UK.
I felt incredibly disturbed by that and offended, abandoned basically. They were so far removed from the tenets of what socialism was supposed to be.
This was a party that their union was affiliated to that seemed to be stabbing them in the back, and that was the language that was used. That was the way firefighters felt about it. And at our 2004 conference, the decision was made to disaffiliate from the Labour Party, a party that we'd been affiliated to since the 1920s.
In the years after 2005, the FBU fought more disputes to protest against cuts and attacks on conditions than in any other period of their entire history. Their actions overturned local attempts to sack and re-engage firefighters and defeated other local plans to privatise the service completely. The union's warnings about the safety of firefighters fell on deaf ears. Between 2003 and 2008, 13 firefighters were killed at fires, the worst 5-year period for 30 years. Firefighters hold regular commemorations of their deaths. In 2010, a Tory Lib Dem coalition replaced New Labour in the wake of the financial crisis. They began a drastic round of austerity with a pay freeze for the public sector and severe cuts to local services.
This is Kingsland Fire Station in Hackney, East London, where I worked for most of my career in the London Fire Brigade. It was a very busy fire station for much of that time, serving this part of Hackney. Lots of tower blocks, lots of fires, and it closed. We've seen record numbers of fire stations close all across the country. 11,000 firefighters, jobs go, dozens and dozens of fire engines axed, and a real reduction in the ability of the fire and rescue service to respond to emergency calls.
We had 8 control rooms throughout Scotland. We now have 3, one north, one in the east and one here in the west. That's been a loss of control staff. There's also been attempts to close fire stations.
Fire service managers in Greater Manchester chose not to close fire stations. However, the number of fire engines was cut. The number of firefighters, frontline operational firefighters, has been halved. From 2,200 in 2003, we now see in the region of 1,000 frontline firefighters.
The government's own figures showed the longest emergency response times to fires for 20 years. In 2013, union members hit back at coalition attacks on their pension rights with a prolonged series of walkouts, strikes, and national protests. The fight continues to this day. The inferno at Grenfell Tower killed 71 people and was the largest loss of life in a fire in the UK since the Blitz. Over 250 firefighters and 70 appliances attended the blaze, drawing upon resources from outside the capital. The tragedy exposed the complacency around fire safety and deregulation of fire safety standards.
I was shocked, and it is an unusual situation. I've never seen anything like that. And you thought, we've got a proper job here. My role as a crew manager on the back of the pump ladder was to be a team leader, number one in the BA crew, and I'd led the crew into one of the floors.
All of the officers that I saw there, they were aware that things were going outside policy. They were aware that firefighters were doing stuff that they wouldn't normally be comfortable with them doing, but I think there was a general consensus that it was required.
We saw crews lost and split up. We saw true heroism.
I was up in the tower, I was a long way into the fire, and the only thing you can think of is, well, I'm a long way into this job. If my equipment does fail, then I'm in trouble.
They were so stretched. They were getting up 10 flights of stairs with that one tank of air. Even the fittest people, you're going to be using all air, so what would they have been able to do?
To hear of firefighters having to go inside and wear breathing apparatus 2, 3, maybe even 4 times, well, that's not a safe system of work, and that screams out to me there's a lack of resources.
If they'd had more personnel, then they may have been able to do more. They would have been definitely able to relieve the guys that were there, that were close to passing out, close to cooking. There were guys that I know I spoke to, they came out steaming, pyrolysing, whereas pyrolysation is basically the process of a material decomposing through heat.
I'll tell you what, how we never lost a firefighter at that job is an absolute miracle. My hat's off to every single, one of them.
These cards and letters we were given by our local community, the Muslim community. It was over the Ramadan period, and a lot of these people were coming in just to show us how much they appreciate us. And it's quite sad because I haven't felt appreciated for so long. And it's such a weird sensation to have someone say thank you, and that shouldn't be right. It shouldn't have to feel like that. To our brave firefighters, thank you for all you did. We know you tried your best. And whoever saves one, it is as if he saved mankind entirely. Like that's as good as a pay rise for your heart, It makes you feel you're wanted.
The axing of fire safety officers to perform regular building inspections also raises deep concerns.
You take away any audit of the Fire and Rescue Service and you'll automatically see a deterioration, and that's what we have seen.
When I first joined, we used to go into the buildings and we'd look at fire extinguishers and fire escapes and everything else, and we could generally point them in the right direction, or we could say we're not happy with this and get fire safety down. But now they're doing it themselves. Nobody knows that it's wrong until it goes wrong.
30 years of deregulation, the ripping up of so-called red tape, has had a devastating effect on the fire service.
I think it's widely understood now that when we talk about red tape in this context, we're talking about the difference sometimes between life and death. We make no apology, therefore, for insisting that the voices of firefighters are now heard, and we have to work and campaign to make sure that actually this does become a turning point.
If governments do not sit up and start listening to the expertise knowledge of the Fire Brigades Union and firefighters, we will continually have horrendous incidents like Grenfell.
3 weeks after the fire, the FBU marched with the trade union movement at the Durham Miners' Gala, as they do every year. The union had re-affiliated to the Labour Party in 2015, when Jeremy Corbyn became leader. Matt Rack spoke for all in honouring the victims.
The best tribute that we can pay to those who lost their lives is to fight for justice and fight for a major change in direction to ensure that this never happens again. It is a result of 3 decades of political assault on the public sector and public services, and on those who deliver them. It's the result of 3 decades of telling us that the market is supreme and we should run our public services as well as though we were running a supermarket. And the people who built our movement, the people who built the trade unions, carried in their hearts and in their heads the idea of a better way of doing things that puts people before profits, that is based on human solidarity, not the narrow interests of a tiny minority. It was called socialism. We need to discuss that today and organise for it tomorrow. Solidarity forever.
Over the past 100 years, the Fire Brigades Union has battled relentlessly to defend the well-being of firefighters and of the public by insisting its voice is heard in the laws that protect society from fire.
To see some government departments speak of the burden that legislation places on British industry and British manufacturing, and therefore this kind of legislation should be watered down or even removed, is absolutely sickening. I find it abhorrent, to be frank, and it's only the Fire Brigades Union which has challenged this at every level, and as recently as the last 18 months to 2 years, the Fire Brigades Union was the lone voice in challenging relaxation of testing on foam-filled furniture.
The future now depends upon a strong and vital membership to ensure that the fight continues.
Sometimes you find new members and new recruits coming into the fire service and thinking, great, I've got a uniform that fits me, I've got the proper PPE, I'm getting my nights off, I'm getting my weekends off, I'm getting holiday pay, I'm getting sick pay, and they all think that that was just handed to them on the plate. It was unions that fought for that.
The National Fire Brigades Union will be a major player in securing the future of the fire service. Anywhere in this country you'll find firefighters going into jobs that other people would not go anywhere near. They're a special breed and they need to be acknowledged as that.